November 18, 1944. 1,430 hours. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, a lumbering C-47 transport plane banked hard left, its cargo doors yawning open to reveal something the Japanese tank commanders below had never seen before, and would never forget. What emerged wasn't supplies or paratroopers. It was a 75mm cannon, and in the next 40 seconds, it would rewrite the rules of ground attack warfare forever. The Americans called it the Dragonfly. The Japanese would call it something else entirely, sure note Tsubasa, Wings of Death. October 3, 1944. MacArthur's headquarters, Hollandia, New Guinea. The morning briefing had turned into what General Walter Kruger would later describe as the most frustrating 2 hours of my military career. Spread across the operations table were reconnaissance photographs from Leyte Gulf, and the story they told was grim. The Japanese had learned. After 3 years of island-hopping campaigns, after Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, the Imperial Japanese Army had finally adapted. Colonel Shiro Takeda, commanding the 16th Tank Division on Leyte, had done what American planners feared most. He had concentrated his armor in ways that negated American air superiority. The photographs showed the evidence. 73 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks and 41 Type 95 Hago light tanks, dug into revetments beneath triple canopy jungle. The positions were masterpieces of camouflage engineering. Each tank was positioned in a carefully constructed earthwork, invisible from above, with overlapping fields of fire covering the invasion beaches. American fighter bombers had proven nearly useless. P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts could strafe and bomb, but their attack runs were too fast, too steep. Pilots reported difficulty acquiring targets beneath the jungle canopy. The few direct hits achieved came at terrible cost, 6 aircraft lost in 2 days for 3 confirmed tank kills. The mathematics were unsustainable. Ground forces faced an even bleaker prospect. Intelligence estimates suggested that reducing these tank positions with conventional infantry assault would cost 3,000 to 4,000 casualties. The Japanese had learned to position their armor to create kill zones where American infantry would be cut down before reaching effective bazooka range. The 2.36-inch rocket launchers carried by infantry squads had a maximum effective range of 150 yards, but Japanese tank gunners could engage at 600 yards or more. Major General Vern Mudge, commanding the 1st Cavalry Division slated for the initial Leyte landings, put it bluntly in the briefing, "Gentlemen, if we go in against those tanks as currently positioned, we're looking at another Tarawa. Except this time, the killing ground isn't a beach, it's 3 miles inland, and there's nowhere to take cover." The silence that followed was broken by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henderson, an Army Air Forces liaison officer who had been sitting quietly in the corner. Henderson was not a combat pilot. He was an engineer, formerly with Douglas Aircraft, who had been assigned to MacArthur's staff to solve unusual technical problems. He had been studying the reconnaissance photos with increasing interest. "General," Henderson said, standing up and approaching the table, "what if we didn't try to hit them from above? What if we came in from the side instead?" The room turned to look at him. Kruger's expression was somewhere between irritation and curiosity. "Elaborate, Colonel." Henderson pointed to the photographs. "These tanks are positioned for direct fire against ground forces and overhead attack from dive bombers. But look at the angles. They're in defilade positions, protected from the front and above. Their flanks are exposed to lateral fire. If we could get a weapons platform that could fly low and slow enough to engage from the side." "We don't have gunships, Colonel," Kruger interrupted. "Our attack aircraft are designed for speed and altitude." Henderson smiled. "No sir, we don't have gunships. But we have something better. We have C-47s. Hundreds of them. And I think I know how to turn one into a tank killer in about 72 hours. October 4, 1944. 2,200 hours. Nadzab Airfield, New Guinea. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, a work crew of 37 men surrounded a weathered C-47 Skitran that had been pulled into an isolated maintenance hangar. The aircraft, tail number 42 to 24,338, had completed 247 combat missions hauling supplies and paratroopers. In the next 18 hours, it would become something entirely new. Henderson had assembled an unusual team. Captain Robert Gilmore, an ordnance specialist who had worked at Aberdeen Proving Ground before the war. First Lieutenant James Kowalski, a structural engineer from Boeing. Master Sergeant Theodore Braun, a master mechanic who could fabricate anything from scrap metal. And crucially, a young Navy lieutenant named William Foster, who had served on destroyer escorts and understood the principles of naval gunnery. The concept Henderson proposed was audacious bordering on insane. Remove the C-47's port side cargo door entirely. Mount a 75mm M5 tank cannon, salvaged from a damaged M4 Sherman, inside the cargo bay. Rig a mounting system that would allow the gun to traverse and elevate while in flight. Install ammunition racks and a manual loading system. And do it all without compromising the aircraft's structural integrity or flight characteristics. The theory is sound, Foster explained to the skeptical crew chiefs gathered around a makeshift blackboard where he had drawn diagrams. It's called lateral fire support. Instead of diving at the target, we fly in a banked circle, what the Navy calls a pylon turn. The aircraft orbits the target at maybe 130 knots, 1,500 feet altitude. The gunner aims by watching tracers and adjusting fire. Continuous engagement, sustained accuracy. The first challenge was weight distribution. The M5 cannon weighed 927 pounds. With mounting hardware, recoil system, and 40 rounds of 75mm ammunition, they were adding nearly 2,800 pounds to the aircraft, and all of it on one side. Kowalski solved this by designing a counterweight system using steel plates mounted in the starboard cargo bay. Not elegant, but effective. The mounting system proved more complex. The cannon's recoil would generate forces the C-47's cargo floor was never designed to handle. Braun's team welded a steel frame that distributed recoil loads across 6 points tied into the aircraft's main structural members. They reinforced the floor with quarter-inch steel plates scavenged from damaged landing craft. By 0300 hours on October 5, the cannon was mounted. Foster had rigged a simple but effective sighting system, a steel tube welded parallel to the barrel with reference marks scratched into the inside. The gunner would lie prone on a padded platform, peer through the tube, and aim by watching where previous rounds impacted. The ammunition feed was entirely manual. 2 loaders would hand rounds forward to the gunner. Rate of fire would be slow, maybe 6 to 8 rounds per minute, but Foster calculated that in a sustained orbit, even that rate would be devastating against stationary armor. At 0630 hours, with the work crew exhausted and running on coffee and adrenaline, Henderson climbed into the modified aircraft and studied what they had created. The cannon protruded from the open port side cargo door like a grotesque growth. The interior was cramped, barely enough room for the gun crew to work. The whole contraption looked like something built in a garage, not a military modification. "Sir," Gilmore said, reading Henderson's expression, "it's ugly as hell." Henderson nodded. "It is. But if it works, it'll be the most beautiful thing those tankers on Leyte have ever seen. Get me a test crew. We fly at 1,400 hours. October 5, 1944. 1,427 hours. Over the Markham Valley, New Guinea. Captain Ernest Thornton, a transport pilot with 892 flight hours in C-47s, had flown supply runs, paratrooper drops, and medical evacuations. He had never flown a gunship, because gunships didn't exist in the U.S. Army Air Force's inventory. Until today. The modified C-47, now designated AC-47X in Henderson's hastily typed test documentation, climbed to 1,800 feet above the valley floor. Below, engineers had positioned 3 derelict Type 95 Hago tanks captured from the Japanese in earlier campaigns. The tanks had been arranged in a triangular pattern, approximately 150 feet apart, simulating a defensive position. Beginning pylon turn, Thornton announced over the intercom, his voice tight with concentration, The C-47 banked left, the port wing dropping as the aircraft entered a tight coordinated turn. Inside the cargo bay, Lieutenant Foster lay prone behind the mounted 75mm cannon, eye pressed to the improvised sight. The physics of lateral fire were counterintuitive. The aircraft wasn't aiming at the target, the pilot was. Thornton had to maintain precise altitude, airspeed, and bank angle. If he did everything correctly, the turning radius would position the target at a fixed point relative to the aircraft. The gunner simply had to compensate for the aircraft's forward motion and gravity drop. "Target in sight," Foster reported. Through the open cargo door, the valley floor rotated slowly beneath them. The derelict tanks appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared as Thornton adjusted the turn. "Stand by, firing." The 75mm cannon roared. Inside the enclosed cargo bay, the blast was deafening despite the crew wearing leather flying helmets stuffed with cotton wadding. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke filled the cargo compartment. The spent shell casing clanged against the steel floor. Below, a fountain of earth erupted 70 feet short of the nearest tank. "Over!" Foster called. Sergeant Braun and Corporal Davies, serving as loaders, muscled another round into the breech. The loading process took 18 seconds, slower than hoped, but workable. Adjusting, Foster muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The sight picture was all wrong. He was thinking like an artilleryman when he needed to think like, what? This had never been done before. There was no doctrine, no manual, no training. Just improvisation and geometry. Second shot. The cannon roared again. This time, the round impacted 30 feet beyond the target tank, sending up a geyser of mud. "Straddled," Foster reported, allowing himself a slight smile. In artillery terms, when you had one round short and one long, you had the range. Now it was just adjustment for deflection. Third shot, 22 seconds after the second. The 75mm round struck the derelict Type 95 directly on its sloped frontal armor. Even from 1,800 feet, the observers in the aircraft could see the impact. The tank shuddered, and a section of its armor plate peeled away like paper. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, observing from a P-38 flying chase, transmitted simply, "Continue firing." What followed was a demonstration that would change ground attack doctrine. Over the next 4 minutes, Foster and his crew fired 17 more rounds. Thornton maintained the pylon turn with increasing confidence, adjusting slightly for wind drift and the aircraft's changing weight as ammunition was expended. Hit rate, 11 direct hits out of 20 rounds fired. The 3 derelict tanks were reduced to twisted metal. The concept was proven. A cargo aircraft, moving at 130 knots in a steady turn, could deliver accurate, sustained fire against ground targets with devastating effect. When Thornton finally leveled the aircraft and turned for home, Henderson's voice came over the radio again, "Gentlemen, you've just created a new type of warfare. Now we need to do it 7 more times before the Leyte invasion. We have 9 days." The crew in the AC-47X didn't cheer. They were too exhausted, too deafened, too overwhelmed by what they had accomplished. But as Foster pulled his eye away from the gun sight and looked at his crewmates, Braun and Davies, both grinning despite the smoke and noise, he understood what they had done. They had turned a transport plane into a weapon of war. And somewhere on Leyte, 73 Japanese tanks were about to face an enemy they couldn't hide from, couldn't dig in against, and couldn't escape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. October 6, 1944. 0530 hours. Port Moresby, New Guinea. Henderson's requisition order landed on the desk of Colonel Raymond Garrett, commanding the 5th Air Force Service Command, like a bomb. The document requested immediate release of 7 additional C-47 aircraft to be pulled from active transport duty, 8 75mm M5 cannons with mounting hardware, 2,800 rounds of armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition, 42 skilled metalworkers and aircraft mechanics, and priority authorization for all necessary materials. Garrett read the order twice, then reached for his telephone. "Get me Henderson. Now." The conversation that followed lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, Garrett sat in silence, then picked up the phone again. "Get me General Kenny's Chief of Staff. Tell him it's urgent." Lieutenant General George Kenny, commanding 5th Air Force, had built his reputation on innovation and aggressive tactical thinking. When Garrett's briefing reached him at 0720 hours, Kenny's response was immediate: "Do it. Whatever he needs. Pull aircraft from the 317th Troop Carrier Group. They're between operations." And Garrett? "This doesn't get logged through normal channels. We're calling this Project Dragonfly. Need to know only until after Leyte." The security classification was necessary. If the Japanese learned that American forces were fielding a new weapon system capable of sustained anti-armor operations, they might adapt their defensive tactics. Surprise would be complete, or the project would be worthless. By 0900 hours, 7 additional C-47s were being towed into isolated hangars at 3 different airfields: Nadzab, Dobadura, and Port Moresby. Each location received a team led by one of Henderson's original crew. Gilmore took Dobadura. Kowalski supervised Nadzab. Henderson himself remained at Port Moresby, coordinating the overall effort. The production methodology was brutally simple: copy exactly what worked on the prototype. No improvements, no refinements, no clever modifications. Every aircraft would be identical to AC-47X. Braun had created detailed templates for the mounting frame. The welding specifications were documented in a hastily typed manual with hand-drawn diagrams. Even the counterweight system was standardized. Each aircraft would carry precisely 1,847 pounds of steel plate in the starboard bay. The bottleneck was cannons. The Ordnance Department had M5 guns, but they were allocated to Sherman tank production. Henderson's requisition triggered a frantic search through Pacific Theater supply depots. 2 cannons came from damaged tanks awaiting repair. 3 more were pulled from tanks slated for conversion to flamethrower variants. 1 gun was discovered in a depot in Australia, shipped there by mistake 6 months earlier. The final 2 cannons arrived on October 9 aboard a Liberty ship from San Francisco. Henderson had somehow convinced someone at Ordnance Department headquarters to expedite a special shipment. Ammunition posed different challenges. The 75mm rounds had to be armor-piercing for anti-tank work, but Henderson also wanted high-explosive rounds for suppressing infantry positions. The compromise loadout: 30 rounds of M61 armor-piercing capped, 10 rounds of M48 high-explosive. Each aircraft would carry enough ammunition for approximately 6 minutes of sustained combat firing. Training the gun crews began before modifications were complete. Foster developed a 3-day crash course covering gun operation, ammunition handling, emergency procedures, and the unique dynamics of aerial gunnery. The selected crewmen were volunteers. Nobody was ordered into this experimental program. Each crew consisted of 1 gunner, usually an artillery sergeant or tank gunner with combat experience, and 2 loaders, typically aircraft mechanics who understood the C-47 systems. The pilots faced their own learning curve. Thornton became the chief instructor, teaching the precise flight parameters required for effective pylon turns. Altitude: 1,500 to 2,000 feet. Airspeed: 120 to 140 knots. Bank angle: 30 to 40 degrees. Turning radius: approximately 1,200 feet. The pilot had to maintain these parameters while under potential ground fire, in formation with other aircraft, and while the gun crew was firing a cannon 10 feet behind him. By October 12, 6 days after the prototype test, all 8 AC-47X aircraft were modified and undergoing flight testing. The pace was exhausting. Mechanics worked 18-hour shifts. Henderson slept 4 hours a night in a cot beside his field desk. Coffee consumption across the 3 airfields reached what supply officers described as unsustainable levels. On October 13, General MacArthur visited Nadzab Airfield. The visit was unannounced. MacArthur wanted to see Project Dragonfly himself. Henderson gave a brief demonstration, an AC-47X firing on ground targets while MacArthur watched from beside the runway. After the aircraft landed, MacArthur approached Henderson. "Colonel, how confident are you in this weapon system?" Henderson had been in the Army long enough to know that honesty with a 4-star general was either career-ending or career-making. "Sir, it's never been done before. We're inventing doctrine as we go. But the physics work. The tests work. The crews are good. If you give us targets, we'll destroy them." MacArthur studied the modified aircraft, its cannons still smoking from the demonstration. "The invasion begins in 7 days. You'll have your targets, Colonel. 73 of them. October 14, 1944. Tacloban, Leyte Island. Colonel Shiro Takeda's headquarters occupied a reinforced concrete bunker 300 meters inland from what American planners designated Red Beach. On his desk lay the latest intelligence summary from Imperial General Headquarters in Manila, and it made for grim reading. American forces were assembling the largest amphibious operation in Pacific theater history. 7th Fleet had been spotted departing Hollandia with over 700 vessels. 4 divisions, the 1st Cavalry, 7th Infantry, 24th Infantry, and 96th Infantry, were confirmed inbound. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Americans. Naval gunfire support would be overwhelming. But Takeda was not discouraged. He had studied American tactics for 3 years. He understood their patterns, their preferences, their predictability. The Americans relied on firepower to solve every problem. They would bombard the beaches with naval guns. They would strafe with fighters. They would bring tanks ashore and expect to overwhelm Japanese positions through sheer volume of fire. And Takeda had prepared for exactly that. His tank positions were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Each Type 97 Chiha was dug into a revetment with only the turret and main gun exposed. Overhead cover protected against air attack. Interlocking fields of fire ensured that any American armor advancing inland would enter kill zones where 3 or 4 Japanese tanks could engage simultaneously. The 16th Tank Division had trained for 6 months in these positions. Every gun crew knew their target reference points. They had ranged the beaches, the inland approaches, the likely assembly areas. Ammunition was stockpiled in protected bunkers. Fuel reserves were secure. Medical facilities were prepared for extended operations. "We will allow them to land," Takeda explained to his battalion commanders during an October 14 briefing, echoing defensive doctrine established at Iwo Jima. "We will allow them to bring their forces ashore. And when they advance inland, when they believe they have secured the beachhead, we will destroy them. Their tanks cannot effectively engage positions they cannot see. Their infantry cannot advance against concentrated armor fire. We will hold until reinforcements arrive from Ormoc, and then we will drive them back into the sea." Lieutenant Hideaki Yamamoto, commanding the 3rd Tank Company position on the northern approach to Tacloban airfield, voiced the concerns several officers shared. "Colonel, what of American air power? The P-38s and P-47s?" Takeda smiled. "Let them come. We have experienced their attacks at Saipan and Guam. Fighter bombers are ineffective against dug-in armor. They fly too fast, their bombs lack precision, and they expose themselves to anti-aircraft fire with each attack run. We have lost fewer than 5% of our armor to American air attack in the past year. Their aircraft are designed to fight other aircraft, not ground forces." The briefing continued for another hour, covering communications procedures, ammunition conservation, and withdrawal protocols if positions became untenable. But Takeda's confidence was evident throughout. The Americans would come. They would bring their overwhelming firepower. And they would discover that firepower meant nothing against an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't target, and couldn't kill from the air. What Takeda didn't know, what Japanese intelligence had completely failed to detect, was that 8 modified C-47 transport planes were sitting on New Guinea airfields, each carrying a 75mm cannon and a crew trained to use it. The weapon system had no precedent, no intelligence profile, no signature that would alert Japanese observers that anything unusual was being deployed. The Americans called their operational plan Operation King II. The invasion would commence on October 20th at 1000 hours. H-hour. For divisions hitting 6 beaches simultaneously. And following 30 minutes behind the first wave would be 8 AC-47X gunships, orbiting at 1,800 feet, waiting for ground controllers to identify targets. Japanese doctrine assumed American air power would arrive in the form of fast-moving fighters and dive bombers making brief attack runs before departing to rearm. The concept of a cargo plane circling overhead, firing a tank cannon continuously for 6 minutes, then being immediately replaced by another aircraft doing the same thing, this possibility existed nowhere in Japanese tactical thinking. Takeda went to sleep on the night of October 19 confident in his preparations. His tanks were invisible from the air, protected from the ground, and positioned to create a killing ground that would shatter the American advance. He had done everything right according to 3 years of combat experience. Experience that was about to become obsolete. October 20th, 1944. 0700 hours. Red Beach, Leyte Gulf. The naval bombardment that preceded the invasion was unlike anything the Pacific Theater had seen before. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet poured shells onto the landing beaches in a systematic preparation that lasted 90 minutes. The noise was apocalyptic, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard 50 miles inland. At 0845 hours, the first wave of landing craft left the line of departure. Aboard LST-472, Sergeant Vincent Riley of the 1st Cavalry Division's reconnaissance platoon watched the beach through binoculars. Smoke and dust obscured everything. Geysers of water erupted where naval shells fell short. The plan called for his unit to advance rapidly inland, locate Japanese defensive positions, and radio coordinates for airstrikes. Riley had participated in 3 previous amphibious assaults. He knew the pattern. Land under fire, take casualties crossing the beach, fight through immediate defenses, consolidate, then begin the slow, bloody process of advancing inland against prepared positions. Tarawa had taken 4 days. Saipan had taken a month. Leyte was expected to take longer. At 1003 hours, Riley's landing craft hit the beach. The ramp dropped. His squad sprinted across black volcanic sand, expecting machine gun fire, expecting mortar rounds, expecting the hell that defined Pacific amphibious operations. Instead, they encountered light resistance. Sporadic rifle fire from concealed positions. A few mortar rounds landing randomly. Nothing like the coordinated defense they had expected. By 10:45 hours, 4 divisions were ashore. Casualties were surprisingly light, fewer than 200 in the first hour. The beaches were secured. Engineers were already clearing obstacles and establishing supply routes. But battalion commanders reading situation reports grew increasingly concerned. The Japanese weren't defending the beaches. Which meant they were waiting somewhere inland. At 1115 hours, elements of the 7th Infantry Division advancing toward Tacloban Airfield made contact. Not with infantry, with tanks. Type 97 Chihas emerging from concealed positions, their 57mm guns engaging American Sherman tanks at 800 yards. The first 2 American tanks were hit before they could return fire. Infantry attempting to advance with bazooka teams were pinned down by machine gun fire from positions they couldn't locate. The forward air controller with 7th Division, Captain Lawrence Bennett, radioed the situation at 1127 hours. We have enemy armor in dug-in positions, grid coordinates 642 to 391. Request immediate air support. Sherman tanks are taking casualties. Infantry cannot advance. The response came not from a fighter squadron but from Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, orbiting at 8,000 feet in a standard C-47 serving as airborne command post. Dragonfly, this is Dragon Control. You are cleared to engage. Target coordinates 642 to 391. Enemy armor and revetments. Expect multiple targets in close proximity. At 1,134 hours, Captain Ernest Thornton banked his AC-47X into a pylon turn at 1,800 feet altitude, directly above the engagement. Through the open cargo door, Lieutenant Foster could see the battlefield below, American tanks burning, infantry pinned in open ground, and somewhere in the jungle, concealed Japanese armor that had already killed 8 Americans in the past 7 minutes. Target acquired, Foster reported. I pressed to his gun sight. The C-47 completed its turn. The jungle rotated into view. And then, clearly visible despite camouflage netting, a Japanese Type 97 tank, its turret traversing to engage another Sherman. Foster squeezed the trigger. The 75mm cannon roared. The first round in combat for Project Dragonfly. The shell crossed 1,800 feet in just over a second, following a ballistic arc that Foster had calculated in his head through pure instinct in 3 weeks of intensive training. The armor-piercing round struck the Type 97's turret at a near-vertical angle. The Japanese tank's armor, designed to deflect rounds fired horizontally from other tanks, provided no protection against a shell arriving from above. The round penetrated, detonated, and turned the tank's interior into an inferno. Hit. Foster called, already adjusting for the next target. Sergeant Braun and Corporal Davies rammed another round into the breach. 20 seconds from first shot to second shot. The loading time was improving with practice. The second tank, positioned 30 yards from the first, was already attempting to relocate. Japanese doctrine called for armor to displace after firing to avoid counter-battery fire. But relocating required leaving the protective revetment, exposing the tank's thin side armor. Foster tracked the movement, led the target slightly, and fired. Another hit. The Type 97 shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Below, Captain Bennett watched in disbelief as the Japanese tanks that had been systematically destroying his armor support were themselves being destroyed by an aircraft he couldn't identify. It looked like a transport plane. But transport planes didn't carry cannons. And they certainly didn't orbit in lazy circles, firing with the precision of a trained artillery battery. Dragon Control, this is Ground Observer, Bennett transmitted. Whatever you're shooting them with, keep doing it. Enemy armor is being neutralized. I count 3, no, for enemy tanks destroyed. They're attempting to withdraw. Foster had already spotted the withdrawal. 2 more Type 97s were backing out of their positions, trying to reach the tree line. Bad decision. Movement made them visible. Invisibility meant death. Third shot. Fourth shot. Both hits. One tank stopped dead, its treads blown off. The second tank made it to the tree line before a 5th shot from Foster's gun struck it in the rear deck, igniting its fuel tanks. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. 5 Japanese tanks destroyed. 0 American aircraft damaged. The gun crew had fired 19 rounds, hit rate of 26%, which in aerial gunnery terms was extraordinary. As Thornton pulled the AC-47X out of its orbit and headed back toward base to rearm, Foster allowed himself a moment to process what had just happened. They had proven the concept in combat. The transport plane had become a tank killer. And somewhere below, Japanese tank commanders were realizing that their carefully prepared defensive positions had become death traps. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. October 20th, 1944. 1,420 hours. Northern approach to Tacloban Airfield. The afternoon sun beat down on Lieutenant Hideaki Yamamoto's Type 97 Chiha as he crouched in the commander's hatch, scanning the sky with increasing anxiety. Radio communications from Colonel Takeda's headquarters had been fragmentary and alarming. Multiple tank positions destroyed. Enemy aircraft engaging with unknown weapons. Units requesting permission to withdraw. Yamamoto commanded 4 tanks positioned to cover the approach to the airfield, the most critical defensive sector on the island. His crews had trained for 6 months. Every firing position was meticulously prepared. Ammunition was stockpiled. Fields of fire were cleared and ranged. They were ready for American armor, American infantry, American fighter bombers making their predictable diving attacks. They were not ready for what appeared at 1,437 hours. The sound came first, the distinctive twin-engine drone of a C-47 transport. Yamamoto ignored it initially. Transport planes were not threats. They carried supplies and paratroopers, not weapons. But this C-47 wasn't following a transport flight path. It was circling. Banking in a tight left turn at perhaps 1,800 feet, orbiting directly above Yamamoto's position. "Commander, that aircraft," his gunner, Corporal Sato, began. The first 75mm round struck before Sato could finish the sentence. The shell hit 20 meters short, sending up a fountain of earth and shattered wood. Yamamoto's mind struggled to process what had happened. Transport planes didn't carry cannons. It was impossible. The second round hit Lieutenant Tanaka's tank, positioned 40 meters to Yamamoto's right. The shell struck at a steep angle, penetrating the thin top armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. The tank didn't explode, it simply stopped, smoke pouring from every opening. Yamamoto knew without checking that Tanaka and his crew were dead. "All tanks, relocate immediately." Yamamoto transmitted, his voice cracking despite his attempt at command authority. Displace to alternate positions. But relocating meant leaving the protective revetments. It meant exposing thin side armor while maneuvering. And the aircraft above was still circling, still firing. Yamamoto watched in horror as Sergeant Ito's tank backed out of its position, turned toward the tree line, and was struck by a third round that tore through its engine deck. The tank rolled another 10 meters before stopping, flames erupting from the engine compartment. The fourth round hit the revetment 6 meters from Yamamoto's position, showering his tank with debris. The fifth round missed entirely, impacting in the jungle 50 meters beyond. But the sixth round struck Corporal Nakamura's tank squarely on the turret, destroying it completely. In less than 3 minutes, 3 of Yamamoto's 4 tanks had been eliminated. He was alone, his crew paralyzed with terror, watching a lumbering transport plane circle lazily overhead while systematically destroying positions that had taken months to prepare. The radio crackled. Colonel Takeda's voice, strained and urgent, "All units, enemy aircraft with large-caliber weapons engaging armor positions. Attempt to withdraw to secondary positions. Maintain," static interrupted the transmission. Then silence. Yamamoto made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier. "Driver, withdraw. Maximum speed. Head for the northern jungle." His driver, Private Kojima, didn't hesitate. The Type 97 lurched backward out of its revetment, tracks churning volcanic soil as it turned toward the tree line. Yamamoto expected the next round to kill them. He closed his eyes, waiting for the impact. It never came. The AC-47X had expended its ammunition load and was already turning back toward its base to rearm. But Yamamoto didn't know that. He only knew that his tank was still moving, still alive, abandoning a position his commander had ordered him to hold to the death. By 1600 hours, the pattern was repeating across the entire Japanese defensive line. Radio intercepts decoded by American signals intelligence documented the collapse. Units reporting heavy casualties from aerial cannon fire. Requests for permission to withdraw. Abandoned positions. Tank crews fleeing into the jungle, leaving their vehicles behind rather than face the circling aircraft that could kill them from angles they had never anticipated. The psychological impact exceeded the physical destruction. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized courage, discipline, and willingness to die for the emperor. But that doctrine assumed death would come in combat. They understood, tank versus tank, infantry assault, even airstrikes from diving fighters. The AC-47X gunships represented something outside their tactical framework, a weapon that circled overhead like a patient predator, firing with methodical precision, impossible to escape and nearly impossible to fight. By nightfall on October 20th, Colonel Takeda's 16th Tank Division had lost 31 tanks destroyed and another 18 abandoned by their crews. The defensive line designed to shatter the American advance had been shattered instead. And 8 modified cargo planes, carrying weapons that officially didn't exist, had accomplished what would have cost thousands of American casualties using conventional tactics. Captain Bennett, the forward air controller who had witnessed the first engagement, transmitted his after-action report at 1847 hours, enemy armor threat neutralized. Dragonfly aircraft proved devastatingly effective. Recommend immediate expansion of program. This weapon system is a war winner. November 15, 1944. Clark Air Base, Luzon. The war continued, but the nature of ground attack warfare had been permanently altered. Across the Pacific Theater, 53 AC-47X gunships were now operational, with another 47 in various stages of modification. What Henderson had created in desperation had become a cornerstone of American tactical aviation. The Japanese had attempted countermeasures, but each proved inadequate. They tried enhanced camouflage. The gunship's sustained orbits allowed crews to spot even well-concealed positions. They tried dispersing armor across wider areas. The AC-47X simply engaged targets sequentially until ammunition was exhausted, then returned to base while another aircraft continued the mission. They attempted to engage the orbiting gunships with anti-aircraft fire, but hitting a target at 1,800 feet while under fire from that same target proved nearly impossible. By December 1944, captured Japanese tactical documents showed that commanders were advising units to abandon prepared positions when AC-47X aircraft appeared overhead. This represented complete reversal of defensive doctrine. Positions that had taken months to construct were being surrendered without fight rather than face the methodical destruction the gunships delivered. The casualty statistics told the story more clearly than any tactical analysis. Operations on Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, battles that military planners had expected to rival Leyte in cost, saw significantly lower American casualties than pre-invasion estimates. The AC-47X gunships weren't the only factor, but post-war analysis credited them with reducing estimated casualties by approximately 30 to 40% in operations where they were employed. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson received the Distinguished Service Cross in January 1945. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary heroism and technical innovation in the development of aerial weapons systems that saved countless American lives and contributed materially to the success of operations in the Pacific Theater. Henderson accepted the medal, then immediately returned to New Guinea to supervise training of additional crews. The human cost was documented in ways that official reports couldn't capture. Captain Ernest Thornton, the pilot who had flown the first combat mission, completed 63 AC-47X sorties before being rotated home in March 1945. He testified later to military historians that the psychological burden of the work was unique. You're not in a dogfight where everything happens in seconds. You're orbiting, watching, firing, watching the results. You see everything. It's more like artillery work than flying, except you're in the aircraft when you do it. Lieutenant William Foster, the naval officer who had designed the gun sight system and served as gunner on the prototype, was killed on February 17, 1945 when his AC-47X was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Corregidor. He had fired his final round moments before the aircraft was struck. The target, a Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank, was destroyed. Foster's body was recovered, and he was buried with full military honors at Manila American Cemetery. His innovations lived on in every AC-47X that continued flying combat missions. The Japanese perspective emerged through post-war interrogations and testimony. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, acknowledged in testimony before war crimes tribunals that the AC-47X gunships had rendered conventional armor defense untenable and had forced complete revision of defensive tactics at a time when we lacked resources to implement such revisions. More poignant were testimonies from ordinary soldiers. A former tank commander, interviewed in 1947, stated, "We were prepared to die fighting American tanks, American infantry, American warships. We were not prepared for an enemy that could circle above us, invisible and untouchable, destroying our positions one by one while we could do nothing but wait for death or flee like cowards. It destroyed not just our tanks but our sense of purpose. The AC-47X program officially ended in September 1945 with Japan's surrender. The modified aircraft were gradually returned to transport configuration or scrapped. But the concept, sustained aerial fire from a stable orbiting platform, would be resurrected 20 years later in Vietnam with the AC-47 Spooky gunship, armed with miniguns instead of cannons. The lineage was direct, from Henderson's desperate improvisation to the modern gunships that continue flying combat missions today. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, preserves one AC-47X, carefully restored to its 1944 configuration. The placard beside it reads, AC-47X Dragonfly. Modified C-47 Skitran with 75mm M5 cannon. Developed October 1944. Combat Operations, October 1944 to September 1945. This aircraft represents one of the most significant tactical innovations of World War II, demonstrating how ingenuity and adaptation could overcome seemingly insurmountable defensive advantages. Veterans of the program held their final reunion in October 2004, the 60th anniversary of the Leyte landings. 7 men attended: pilots, gunners, loaders, and ground crew. They gathered at the museum, standing beside the preserved aircraft, and shared memories that official histories couldn't capture. The improvisation. The terror. The exhaustion. The mathematical certainty that what they were doing was saving lives, even as it took them. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henderson died in 1987 at age 73. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his wartime service but focused primarily on his post-war career in aerospace engineering. It didn't mention that in October 1944, working with a handful of skilled men in a hangar in New Guinea, he had created a weapon system that changed the nature of warfare. But the men who flew with him knew. The soldiers who advanced inland at Leyte, spared the casualties that conventional tactics would have demanded, knew. And the Japanese tank crews who faced the Dragonfly's circling fire knew better than anyone what Henderson had accomplished. The 8 flame tanks at Iwo Jima and the 8 AC-47X gunships at Leyte represented the same fundamental truth: in industrial warfare, innovation and adaptation matter as much as courage. The side that can identify problems, develop solutions, and implement them rapidly holds decisive advantage regardless of the enemy's determination. The streams of liquid fire at Iwo Jima and the 75mm shells falling from circling cargo planes at Leyte were different weapons serving the same purpose, negating defensive advantages through technological superiority that the enemy couldn't counter. Both weapons saved thousands of American lives. Both inflicted forms of combat that haunted those who employed them and terrified those who faced them. Today, the caves of Iwo Jima and the jungle revetments of Leyte stand empty, monuments to battles won through innovation as much as valor. The flames have long since cooled. The shell craters have filled with vegetation. But the lesson remains: in the mathematics of modern war, the side that innovates fastest usually wins, regardless of the courage on the other side of the equation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.